Thanks all of you for joining me this afternoon. It's a great pleasure. I'm very aware that we've got a very high-powered panel this afternoon. We've got an hour to talk about this. What I'm hoping we'll get out of this this afternoon is a sense of what you, as great experts in the field, see as the ways in which we've made progress over the last 10, 20 years, and then also about how you think we can make more progress over the next decade. It's quite clear that we need to speed up with the progress that we're making. I'm going to go around each of you to just ask you to briefly introduce yourselves and then tell us what you think have been the great examples of success. And Tim, if I may, I'm going to start with you. Tim Harris, CEO of Wesgrow. Very important to the origins of responsible tourism, but also I think, Tim, what you have to offer is a perspective which is wider than just tourism. And where do you see tourism having made progress on the sustainability and responsibility agenda?
Thanks a lot, Prof. We at Wesgrow are responsible, as you say, for promoting tourism across the Western Cape province here in South Africa, but we also happen to be responsible for economic promotion. So we do say that one of the things that people need to realize is, certainly for us and for many places around the world, tourism is big business. So we measure everything in terms of the impacts on the bottom line. And I think in that respect, the gathering of people that signed the Cape Town Declaration in 2002, which first set out the agenda for responsible tourism and meets every year around WTM Africa to recognize examples of best practice in the space, I think hopefully started to trigger a narrative around how responsible tourism will increasingly not be something happening on the fringe of tourism globally, but become mainstreamed. And that's always a reflection that we make at the Responsible Tourism Awards for Africa. And I feel like over the years, it's becoming more and more a reality. I think it's happening, Harold, for three reasons. The first one is, as you've said, consumer choice is taking tourism products and offerings in that direction. Consumers are much more concerned, rightly so, about the environmental and social impact of their choices and the businesses that they transact with. Secondly, climate change has forced destinations and governments to confront the realities of resource shortages. Our example in Cape Town around the drought that we suffered in 2018 and the famous Day Zero campaign to attempt to engineer change on behalf of consumers had a massive impact on tourism for the Western Cape, but in the end was a very good news story because it showed the extent to which locals and tourists could join together to change their consumption of water and actually make sure that Cape Town became the first city in the world to, in a sense, not run out of water when it was a very likely threat. And then thirdly, I think the main accelerant, sitting here now, joining you all on Zoom, has been the pandemic, which has triggered questions not only around public health, but also around the financial viability of a sector that was essentially cut off at the knees by lockdowns all around the world, and is still in a very difficult space. I think it's removed the sense of kind of business as usual across tourism, and people just making their choices as travelers to do what they did the year before or some version of it, and the entire world has stopped and been forced to reflect on the choices they make, both on the industry side in terms of their offering that they put forward, but perhaps more importantly on the consumer side around what their choices will look like when they return to travel as we emerge from lockdown. And that perhaps is the single biggest opportunity to totally reframe the global travel agenda towards responsible tourism.
Tim, you've just reminded me as you were talking, it's interesting for me. I was thinking back to the first time I went into a township, which was obviously around the Cape Town conference in 2002. And many times after that, I'd find myself going in with a white South African who'd never been into a township before, and for some strange reason thought they'd be safer going in with me. It's clearly, you know, but really, what do I know? That was just madness on their part, but they did. And the last time I was in Cape Town, which was for WTM, I was taken by a local guy to a wonderful restaurant in the township. And for the first time, I saw a couple arrive in a bush taxi, having booked it themselves, having had nothing to do other than just pick it off the website. They'd booked in, they turned up, they had a great time, and they got a bush taxi back home. And I thought, you know, just look at the way in which township tourism has changed in Cape Town in those 20 years. It is a really, well, in 18 years, it's a really extraordinary development in terms of that engagement now directly between the individual traveller and that experience, which is always a great experience when you get in there. But Eugenio, can we come to you next? Eugenio Younis, I first knew you when you were at UNWTO, and we worked together a bit. I remember you being one of the sternest critics of my work, which I still remember with a degree of fondness as well as irritation. But you were very good at that. You produced some fantastic documentary work on sustainable tourism, work the like of which, frankly, we've not seen since. But I wondered now, looking back on it, I mean, you were there at the Cape Town conference, and it was a side event to the World Summit, which was why you were in South Africa at that time. But how do you see the progress we've made in the last 18 years? What do you think have been the successes?
Well, thank you, Harold. I'm very glad to be part of this panel today. I think there are a number of concepts that have been now accepted by the tourism community. But that's not enough. I think since 2002, the concept of sustainable and responsible tourism is more widely accepted, but it's not yet, unfortunately, not yet in the mainstream industry. It's still a niche aspect for some consumers, from some operators, for some destinations. However, that's already a big progress, because the principles of sustainable tourism now are almost in every national and regional and local strategy for tourism development. I don't think there is any government which does not introduce the word sustainable and sometimes responsible in their global tourism development strategy. But that doesn't mean to say that they actually convert it into a reality in their destinations. A general progress, I think, that has been made is in the hotel industry worldwide. I think the savings in energy consumption and in moving from contaminating sources of energy to green energies has been enormous, both in small-scale hotel operations and also in large chains. I think that's something really impressive, and I suspect that the reason for this success is that it's linked to cost savings, which is an important incentive for companies to move from contaminating sources to more green sources, and even for supply of their own sources, auto-generating their own sources. That's a main area which I think we have made progress since then. Another one, which you have just quoted, Harold, with your example of this couple getting into a township in South Africa, I've seen that happening in many other places, including in my own country. Now there are many more small operators or even individual tourists, thanks to technological progress and access to the supply in different destinations, that dare to go on themselves, on their own, to a small hotel, to a small restaurant, and that's becoming quite common, not mainstream, but quite common. But I would like to refer to a third big example, which refers to Europe, which I think is very relevant for Africa, because I think the main attraction of Africa for international tourists and also for domestic tourism is nature and protected areas. I think that is the main attraction in Africa. And I think the example of the European Park or Protected Area Federation in developing a charter based on the sustainability principles and actually applying it to over 100 protected areas in Europe, I think is a very good example of the progress made since then. I won't go into the details, but I think the European Protected Areas Charter and the association around it has significantly improved the management of tourists in protected areas in Europe. And I think that could be a very good example for Africa to not to replicate exactly because the conditions are not the same, but there are many good practices there that could be adapted to the reality of protected areas in Africa. So to start, I would provide those three good examples of progress while recognizing that this is still not enough, and unfortunately responsible and sustainable tourism is not yet part of the mainstream industry.
Thanks, Eugenio. Manisha, to turn to India, and you explain a little bit about what you do in a minute, but what's been extraordinary for me is watching the progress that's been made with responsible tourism in Kerala, and I know that you do some of your work there, but we've begun to see now a number of states in India formally adopt responsible tourism. And responsible tourism arrived in India, in 2008, I think, with the Kerala conference. That was the second conference. It took 6 years to get from the first to the second. Now they are happening virtually annually. But Manisha, do you want to say something about where responsible tourism has got to in India and what's successful, what's worked?
Yes, thank you, Harold. It's a privilege to be here in the panel today. Personally, it has been it's been a learning journey from when we started in 2004, and we adopted our first responsible tourism policy. And at that time, I think even whether it was our hills in the Himalayan state of Uttarakhand, where we started our work with 5 villages, I think the very word responsible tourism, what it was then and what it is now, is there's a huge difference in the whole mindset of both the consumer as well as the practitioners, I think, which is, and it's a very positive move. I would say that Kerala as a state sort of led the whole example in India, because initially when we started working in the protected area with an aim to assist the local communities who were suffering with a lot of issues inside a protected region, and how they got involved as a community, and how they not only got widespread benefits in terms of income, but also started to look at conservation as as another aspect that they were also responsible for. That was a big learning for us. We never imagined that just by starting a responsible tourism approach, we will be also able to impact the social lives of the people and the awareness towards the environment, and even how they are now contributing towards conservation. So I think responsible tourism journey has moved on. As I said, it has been, hugely, there has been a movement in how people are now perceiving responsible tourism. I think the only word I heard at that time was ecotourism, which was sort of there in India a lot. People were not very familiar with the principles of responsible tourism. But after, I think, small initiatives like ours, and then, of course, a big program in Kerala where they involve the local communities in a large scale, where the state government is the first government actually to adopt a responsible tourism policy and also work into a responsible tourism mission, for the state. I think set a huge example for so many other people. And now I think with the movement, as I said, it's not restricted only to the inbound. Initially, I think the responsible tourism also had an image issue. people had an image issue that this is going to be very niche kind of travel, and this is not for the normal travelers. But now even that has broken, and I'm not saying this in perspective of only the inbound travelers. This is also very much so in terms of the domestic travelers, which is great. So I think personally what has worked is most for us, I think, is when you are actually involving the local community in decision making, when they can see their direct benefits from tourism, they can be part of the decision making, and then they are also equally, they feel responsible for not just their own community, but in terms of their society in general, in terms of their environment. So it's a matter of empowering the local communities, which has really worked well if you bring that factor in responsible tourism. And as far as in general India is concerned, as I said, now the state governments, you can see a move with, after Kerala, we have now Madhya Pradesh following the lines of the same policy, and they have adopted a responsible tourism policy. I was very happy to see that the national tourism policy has now the responsible tourism within it. I recently went to Ladakh, for a winter conclave, and I was really happy to see that the local youth were speaking about why they want responsible tourism in their state, because they are very sure about what mass tourism will bring as an impact. So this awareness level, which has come from 2004 to now, I see a huge change, and I feel that as a community, when they have been seeing examples of things working on ground, it has been hugely motivating for people also. So I think the power of the community, I would say, has worked well.
It is. I mean, I remember writing, so I drafted the declaration. It's not mine, it belongs to the conference, but I drafted it. And I remember writing the third one about involving local people in decision making about tourism, and wondering if it would ever happen. And actually, it has only begun to happen really in the last 4, 5, 6 years. It was the slowest of all of them to come through, but it has begun to come through now. I think what's distinctive about the Indian approach is it's been very much focused on social benefit for communities, and in a way turned its back on the ecotourism dimension. But Nikki, you do something similar in Durban, don't you, or across Africa, but from Durban?
From Durban. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Harold, to participate in this panel. Yeah, I mean, we're based in KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. I'm the CEO of Africa Ignite. And basically what we do is we run Wow Zulu marketplaces. They are small little locally owned and operated franchises where young people from local communities own and operate them, where they then get involved in the tourism supply chain or the tourism value chain. They identify potential experiences, homestays, all the different activities that can take place in that community, and then develop tours around that. And that is really a model that works very well. It is a model that is highly replicable. Unfortunately, I think for me, and looking back over the past 10 years and 15 years in my experience with responsible tourism, I think the key thing that works or makes responsible tourism works is people. And I'm going to mention a number of examples. And the key thing is, if you don't get the people bought in and active in responsible tourism, then we are never going to be able to replicate. So, for example, some of the areas where responsible tourism do work is where accommodation businesses, and my focus specifically has been on small accommodation businesses, where they take responsibility, where they start being first internal into their inside their business, start making, and I think Eugenio referred to energy efficiency, for example. Once they've started seeing the benefits of that, then they start making the next step, or taking the next step to start understanding how they can actually, look outwards and further that impact that they have, and then start working with local community members. The critical issue that they sit with, of course, is how do we get to the local community members, and that is where organizations like tourism associations play a pivotal role. And again, in South Africa, in some instances, tourism associations do excellent work to bring the commercial businesses and the community businesses together to start networking and interacting. And we've seen some examples where that works really well. But again, it's also in small pockets. So if we can replicate that, it would be wonderful. Another role player, for example, is municipalities. We often see the municipalities, waving the flags and ticking all the boxes, but actually at the end of the day, they hardly have an impact. Whereas in other areas where the municipality really buys in and understands the benefit, work with LED, local economic development officers, understand what impact tourism can have in that area, that is when it works. And that is when tourism gets built into your integrated development plans in local communities. And that's when there's momentum that starts happening. Where organizations identify or see the value of bringing in value chain partners. Now in South Africa, we've got this wonderful thing called BEE, broad-based Black economic empowerment. And where large operators, large commercial businesses want government contracts, they obviously look for supplier development, and they look for ways in which they can invest in local communities. And that is when, tourism can be positively impacted. But again, it had all of these things happen in small pockets. And then another key role player for us is at the moment, mainly international tourists, the inbound. We've seen in South Africa, there's very little interest from the domestic market in the types of tours and experiences that we offer, the local communities, because there's just this kind of, there's a disconnect still culturally in South Africa. So where local tourists have started making that mindset change, that is when responsible tourism will start getting activated. And then the last, a key player for me is also our anchor products in South Africa. We've seen a lot of our anchor products, and I mean, Tim, you sit in Cape Town, that's a huge anchor product in itself. But our national parks, our conservation areas, etc., where there's a key recognition that the tourists come in, they want to spend maybe a day or 2 or 3 days in the national park or in the local anchor product, but then they are interested in going out into the townships and learning more about the local culture. And only then do we start seeing people taking notice, and the local commercial businesses saying, what can we actually do to make sure that when our tourists do go there, that they are safe and secure, and they, the experiences are quality experiences. And, so it's all about people at the end of the day, making that mindset. And key for me is it cannot happen one business at a time or one person at a time. It has to be a collaborative. It has to be a mass scale, collaboration. And I think across South Africa, there are pockets where that works very well, but it's small pockets, and we need to really, get that up and running.
It's interesting. You've reminded me, Nikki, in what you're saying, that one of my great regrets about the way we launched responsible tourism in Cape Town is that the idea got around that somehow responsible tourism was a product. And as much as we said any kind of tourism could be more responsible, we've not been successful in stopping that. The reality is that every kind of tourism can be more responsible. And I think you put your finger on it, as Manisha did. It is about what the people do. And obviously you get more scalability and more impact if you can bring more people together. But Shannon, you've sat very patiently and listened to all of that. You're here in part because you are a representative of a very focused large business with a focus on treading right, but also both an inbound and an outbound operator in a global company. I mean, it'd be really useful to hear from you a little bit more about Tread Right, just a little, and also to hear what you think leads to success in this agenda of sustainability, and in the end, people being encouraged to take responsibility and make the change.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Tread Right Foundation is the not-for-profit arm of an organization called the Travel Corporation. We're a group of 40 global brands, so Thompson's, Cullinan, Trafalgar Travel, Contiki, and Red Carnation Hotels. and a number of other brands, of course. And so TreadRight has been around since 2008, and we're the philanthropic arm of what sustainability means at the Travel Corporation. We also set the direction on sustainability through governing the group's sustainability strategy and implementation of that strategy. And, you know, I think that, okay, so your original question, what it is are we doing? And then I've just gotten so much from this morning's call as well.
Shannon, what do you see as the best examples of success in making tourism better?
That's
reflecting on what you've seen around the world.
Yeah, when it's operationalized, 100%. So, you know, a couple of things, and Nikki's already said it, and so has Manisha. You know, this old approach that sustainable tourism is either niche and or product led cannot be true any longer, because I feel that's exactly the opposite of the direction we need to go to. You know, larger operators, bigger tour operators must also embrace sustainability. And I say it through a very measurable operational approach. And that's the approach that we take. Sustainability is really driven by our product and our operations teams at the Travel Corporation. And that's why we've been successful. And that's who bring us the ideas of how to become more successful, because they're on the ground. They know people like Nikki and Manisha, whereas I wouldn't have that contact. And so they bridge that gap between what's happening in destination and what operators such as myself are doing. And it's a shame that that gap exists, because, you know, that's where I would think associations and DMOs can bring all of those amazing things that are happening locally to those of us that are bringing a destination to a global marketplace. And that gap's something that I've struggled with for a wee while.
Shannon, one of the things that occurs to me about your experience of this is that it would be quite possible for me to sit here as, say, a big inbound operator in South Africa, one of the large operators that South Africa has, and say, we're just not profitable enough to give all that money away. I mean, what is the business case for doing this, Shannon?
Resiliency. I mean, we've just come through COVID and nobody wants that again. And so the case for sustainable tourism at our business is future business resiliency. Stakeholders demand it, consumers demand it. Consumers are going to be demanding it more and more. And we have a unique position where we have youth brand Contiki 18 to 35 moving into brands such as, so we have that whole life cycle. So we're able to watch these changes, and we're able to watch what markets want, and they want to understand it. They want to understand what's behind it. So not just the rhetoric and not just hashtag build back better, but how are you doing it? And are you going to be transparent about the way in which you are doing it? And in a year, are you going to tell me what progress you made against your commitments? So we have a very tough, educated marketplace out there that we must be beholden to. And so we are.
Shannon, forgive me for pushing on this, because as you probably know, I agree with you, but there will be skeptics out there who say, it's just theory. Is it affecting, for example, the amount of repeat booking you get? I mean, what you just said about the life cycle of the tourist and having the different age groups would suggest that this is a serious business strategy for capturing people when they're young and hoping to sell them other products as they grow through that cycle of different travel experiences. Is it making market sense for you? And is it just costing you a lot of money that you can afford to do because you're a highly profitable company, or is it helping to drive a more profitable company?
So we believe it's helping to drive a more profitable company. And we believe that it's helping to drive a company that's front of mind, which is critical to the marketplace. But what's also important to us as a tour operator is people's their propensity to book again is going to be very, very, very dependent on the satisfaction that they will have received through their experience and in destination. And when you go to a destination and you do not get what that destination has built for you, you don't have a wonderful experience. There's no sort of, what word am I looking for? I'm losing
You're not
it.
getting a meaningful connection. You're not getting an experience that makes you want to repeat.
Yes, all other industries have sort of checks and balances in place to make sure that their product is sound. Travel and tourism historically hasn't done that. We've just kind of hoped for it. And a positive in-region destination or in-destination experience that gets repeat travelers. And so if it's not a good place to live anymore, it's not a good place to visit. It's just really that simple at the end of the day. So I don't think it's because we're sitting here and we're big.
No, but it's part of the reason you've got big, I suspect. Tim, can I just come back to you? Because one of the things that intrigues me now is I can go into my local supermarket just across the street from where I live, and I can buy fairly traded wine. And I had reason recently to look up the black wine producers in the Cape. And to be honest, I was quite surprised by how many there are. I mean, it's clearly been a quite vibrant sector. And yet, when I look at the wine tours still being offered in the Cape, they're not there very much.
Yeah, I think so. Look, you've already touched on the kind of real social and I guess political elements of sustainability and responsible choices, in which South Africa has in bucket loads, and the Cape too. And yeah, one of the reasons why this is a fascinating place to be driving change is because so much change is required. So there is, as you say, much more change that's happened in the wine industry in recent years than people realize, but it's happening on the wine producer side. So we work with many black wine producers making extraordinary products, and our main mission at Wesgro is to help export that product, some of which is extremely successful in global markets. So really, it's not just a question of being seen to do the right thing. The final product is actually globally competitive, and people buy it regardless of what color the winemaker is. That change has happened much faster on the production side because the barriers to entry are lower than it has in terms of the sort of major wine farm ownership and sort of major wine establishments that are on the wine tourism routes around the Cape. It's by definition, those are just assets that are larger, and change will happen slower. It's much easier to start producing a wine as a new winemaker than it is to find a way of buying Groot Constantia. So the change is happening, but it's if you're measuring it by who owns the wine farms, then yes, it's happening slower than if you're measuring it by who's making the extraordinary wine. But I think, Harold, that also kind of emphasizes, I guess, the threat and the opportunity around doing this kind of responsible tourism work in Africa, right? The threats, and we've experienced it now in the last year, is that there's fewer financial resources. It's a much less developed economy in general across Africa, and tourism within that. So when the tide goes out and the tourists stop coming, the governments in the north are able to shore up businesses to a degree that's just unimaginable across Africa. And it means that resilience that Shannon's talking about is just not here on a financial, against financial measurement. The interesting flip side of that is that often that development that's happened in other places around the world historically has not been sustainable or responsible. So you end up with the situation where the natural resources are in a better state in Africa than they are in many other so-called developed markets around the world, because that development has essentially traded those natural resources. And we're in a fortunate position where actually much of that remains. I mean, the obvious example is the kind of charismatic megafauna which Africa still has, and which kind of shores up our tourism offer globally. But that's just the thin end of the wedge, and we've got more natural resources by almost any count. So it's interesting how there's different ways that you can look at that resilience that Shannon's talking about. And I guess now that we're all thinking about what the UNWTO has said around driving recovery and these kind of 6 action areas that they've defined, the one that is most, I think, important for us to get right in Africa is this one that they call biodiversity conservation. And under this area, the UNWTO is talking about the kind of climate agenda and the effect of long-haul tourism on carbon emissions. The truth is, there's no destinations in Africa catering to international tourists that aren't long-haul. You have to fly in the overwhelming number of cases to reach the African tourism offer. And the truth is, without long-haul travel, a lot of the African tourism offering is not sustainable, which means those resources I spoke about will not be preserved. And it's a fascinating and very complex issue that we have to get right. But we're highly vulnerable to what might be a kind of overreaction to the climate impact of long-haul travel, where the calculation is not being done correctly. The idea is, if we don't fly, we will help the environment. Well, maybe if you don't fly, you won't support responsible tourism in Africa, which will end up preserving the things that we most value.
Tim, on another occasion, you and I should talk about what we're trying to do in terms of encouraging the aviation industry to move over to a less polluting fuel, which is clearly possible. But again, there's reluctance to make the investments which are necessary. I think that's what has to happen. We have to find a way of decarbonising aviation in the next few years. Eugenio, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, what Tim has said is also relevant for most developing destinations around the world, because it's true for Latin America as well, and it's true for most destinations in Asia. So it's not that simple to say, let's stop long-haul travel to be more responsible. There are many other ways to reduce carbon emissions by airlines, but also the impact that Tim has rightly mentioned of tourism in protecting biodiversity in destination countries as well.
I'd like us, I think there's probably broad agreement in this group about that. I'd like us to come back, if you're happy to do so, to more the question of what we can actually do in the destinations. And one of the things which seems to me to characterize this is that it is actually at the destinations where the tourists and the locals interact, which is not often at the national level. Only in very small countries does that happen at the national level. In the main, it happens in national parks or in areas governed by local government. And even the Cape, the Western Cape, Tim, is a bit big, isn't it? I mean, the tourists actually interact in Cape Town or in Constantia or in Paarl. They don't interact in the Cape as a whole. And the way they interact will differ from really destination to destination. And that destination is, it makes me laugh when people say they're going on holiday to South Africa. I immediately have to say, well, where in South Africa? Nobody goes on holiday to the whole of South Africa. It's like saying you're going on holiday to America. It doesn't tell you anything really. But it's at that level, isn't it, that we can hope to see responsibility exercised and better forms of tourism made. But what's the instrument for making more of that happen? How do we make more happen at that local level?
Well, if you allow me, Harold, I think the role, you've touched a key point that I had in my talking points for the future, what to do in the future. I think the role of destination management organizations is key to ensure destination sustainability and responsible tourism at destinations. And I think the proliferation of destination management organizations in the last, 15, 20 years has been positive, but with the wrong agenda, because they have concentrated on promotion, getting more and more tourists. and competing with your neighbor, perhaps next door, a few miles away. And I think the role, as the name says, Destination Management Organization, is to manage tourism and even to go beyond management to planning and management, with the main objective of improving the quality of life. And when I mean quality of life, is both the economic and the well-being of resident communities, and also protecting and improving, if possible, through tourism, the natural environment that surrounds those communities, and which are often those natural areas are the base sustained of these communities. Now, this is the main issue that the local management or destination management organization should do, to convert themselves from a promotional organization into a really planning and management organization, including the monitoring of the impacts of tourism in the destination. I think that would be the first issue to change
One of the things that we're certainly seeing, I think, Eugenio, is that more and more, particularly cities, are beginning to talk about worrying about not the number of arrivals, but the yield. How much money is the city making from tourism? And I imagine, Tim, that's part of your thinking as well at Westgar. I'm sure it is. But before I come back and go around again, Manisha, one of the things, I just want to try this out on you, but reflecting on what I've seen happen in Kerala, it seems to me that one of the reasons why responsible tourism has taken off quickly in India is that relationship between the state government all the way away, 20 million, 30 million, 50 million people, really quite remote, but nonetheless there. But then working directly with the panchayat, with the village level local government structure. And it seems to be that combination which in India has delivered quite powerfully. Have I got that right?
Yes, Harold, I think, you know, the community structures, as I emphasized in the first question also, that when the community comes together, you know, towards a certain goal, when the responsibility is collective rather than being individual. I think at that point, when you start taking responsibility for a region rather than your own home, I think that is where the success of responsible tourism lies. And therefore, you know, the structure of the panchayat or the local bodies in communities or in a state, it helps to link people together. And any tourism which collects people together is very positive for the community, because, you know, in that they take both negatives and the positives responsibility together, rather than you know, shedding the shoulder off their shoulders. So I think that's one key which has really worked well as far as Kerala as a state is concerned. And with the state government and the center government generally, you know, because of political reasons, it's not very easy to bridge the gap always between politics and doing some community work. So I think as far as panchayat structure is concerned, or any independent community structure is concerned, it's the responsibility of the state government, or, you know, as Eugenia said, that it needs to be a very responsible DMC or a tour operator, which not only thinks about selling holidays, but also thinks about how this is a privileged access for a consumer to come and have a holiday in one of the most beautiful locations. But equally, it is someone's home, which does not have to be disturbed, and the community are sensitive. So I think that's the gap which is filled either by a good structure within the community and a good operator which balances both sides, because marketing and the community side both are very important for the success, but, you know, they have to also work towards one goal of responsibility. So I think, yeah, panchayat structure is certainly doing a good work, you know, as far as that is concerned.
Tim, you realise, I realised in 2008 in Kerala how easy we'd had it in Cape Town, because that's the only time in 2008 in Kerala I've ever run a conference where there was an active demonstration marching on the conference from the outside. And that was a reflection of the amount of anger that there was in the local community about the way in which they were not benefiting from tourism. So it was inevitable that when responsible tourism came to Kerala, it would have to go in that direction. And it's driven it quite hard to make sure that there was community benefit. But Nikki, before I come back to Shannon, are you recognizing this from your work in KwaZulu-Natal?
What I think in KwaZulu-Natal, I mean, specifically City of Durban is doing quite a lot from a perspective of, there's always this top down and the bottom up. And I think that's the critical thing that Manisha was also talking about, is where government policy needs to filter down to provincial level, to municipal level, and then to grassroots level. And, in between somewhere, the two needs to meet. And I think that's one of the challenges that we sit with, is very often there's a lot of effort coming up from the top and people trying to do something from the bottom, and in between there's no connection. And interestingly enough, I had an interview with ex-City of Durban official a few weeks ago for another project, and I'd like to quote her, because basically what she said is, we really need to now stop doing feasibility studies and business plan. We need to start implementing. And I think that summed it up, because there's, on their shelves lies business cases and feasibility studies for township tourism development that goes back 10, 12, 15 years that have never been implemented. So from my perspective, and what I've seen many, many times, and when I do workshops with people, is inevitably you provide a solution and people will put up their hand and say, well, you know what, actually that won't work for me, or that won't work for me. And my point is, what, it actually has worked already. So just take the model and adapt it, and stop doing more and more and more investigation and analysis. Go and find the models that actually do work already. And there are plentiful of those. There's lovely models in Cape Town that I'm aware of, in Khayelitsha. There's lovely models here locally. There's across the country. As I said earlier, in pockets, people are already doing things that are working really well. So let's stop doing more analysis and feasibilities, and let's rather go learn from those people and understand how we can scale up. In a nutshell, that's my 2 cents worth.
I think that was a very powerful statement. Tim, I'm going to come back to you in a minute. But Shannon, are you recognizing any of this from your more global perspective?
Yeah, I'm just smiling because I agree with Nikki. And you asked me earlier, basically a question about the business case, and I haven't had to tout the business case in about 4 years. So you caught me out, because we've moved so far beyond the business case, and implementation is critical for us as well. So yeah, I'm hearing it, I'm seeing it. Interestingly, talking about DMOs, I agree, and I'll get on that soapbox as well, that there's a really critical role for them to bridge the gap between the me's of the world and sort of the Nikki's and Manisha's of the world. And we want for that. We're reaching out and looking for that. But what I'm finding anecdotally, though, is destinations are now coming to us and saying, we've seen your strategy, can we talk? And I think that is, if I did have to give a business case, it's a proof point on the fact that destinations are paying attention and looking at travel trade partners who we can partner with. And it's the Make Travel Matter Experiences program that they're so keen on, because they know they have it. Now they can package it, tell the story, qualify it, if you will. And that's compelling more and more for destinations, which is encouraging.
Tim, do you want to come back on some of this? I mean, one of the things that must have occurred to you, as it occurs to me every time that we do the awards in Africa, is we see these, frankly, fantastic examples of really good practice. And the reason we started the awards was in the hope that people would see them and then replicate them. But if I'm honest, it's another one of the areas where I've failed. We haven't got that much replication of those best examples, and I think that's a crying shame, but that is the reality that we need to face up to, about how we encourage. It's in a way, it's the same point that Shannon's making. How do we get more people to take these proven examples and use them? And most of the responsible tourism businesses that win are highly profitable businesses. Tim, I'm hoping you got the answer to this, because it's bugging.
No, I do. Sorry, I just couldn't find the mute button after a year of doing these calls. Or the unmute button. Sorry, Harold. Yeah, I look, I've got a few thoughts on this. The first one is I don't think you should underestimate the importance of the awards. They you know, we've been sponsoring since 2015, and
first year sponsors.
yeah, and for us, it's always amazing how much impact the awards make, not just within the sector, but in the sort of general media coverage and the spotlight that goes on to a very, you know, WTM Africa is a very crowded space, but I think responsible tourism always stands out because of the awards, because of the idea of recognizing best practice. You know, I was thinking about our winner last year, Grootbos. Grootbos is a fascinating offer. I think I always wonder how the folk that sell Grootbos around the world very successfully do it, because South African tourism is kind of historically associated with like big dramatic, you know, animals and wildlife, and Grootbos is just up the road from the kind of one of the shark cage diving centers of the world, where you can get in the water with great whites, and Grootbos is an unbelievable experience, but it's got none of that large scale drama. It's got huge amounts of very small scale drama around biodiversity and the Fynbos biosphere, and it's an incredibly beautiful place, but it doesn't have any of the drama at face value, until when you go there, you realize that it makes you think again about your priorities as a traveler and your priorities as someone who makes an impact on the world. And I think that's probably what Grootbos is selling. I'm sure they would disagree with me and have much more to add to that. I don't think I've done a particularly good job, but I think one of the reasons they were the winner is because they've captured this kind of consumer demand for thinking about how they can be more responsible. Incidentally, those sharks down the road, it's really just a stone's throw away from Grootbos. They've gone. We've had crazy issues around diving with great white sharks, because they're just somewhere between none and maybe one or two left. And there's lots of theories about why that's happened. Some interesting ones are that they've been chased away by orcas. Others is that there's pollution in the water that's pushing them offshore. Another is that the really large scale shark fisheries that fish for smaller sharks is taking out their main prey. So, I mean, you talk about the kind of big dramatic things that we offer in South Africa and in the Western Cape as tourist experiences being impacted by certainly some serious impacts on natural ecosystems. And it's all happening within a stone's throw of Grootbos. I think that story pretty much tells you everything you need to know about why responsible tourism will just become the way we do tourism. Just one other point around your experience in India with the protests. It did remind me of, I mean, I think Cape Town's doing fairly well on this call in terms of models of responsible tourism and best practice. But even just behind me here in the Wesgro office, we've got a community called Bo-Kaap. And if you've been to Cape Town or you've seen the marketing material, it's famous for these kind of iconic colored houses, because it's a very old Muslim community where that was the tradition to kind of embrace culture through this colorful expression of painting the houses. And it actually dates back from this kind of effort to break away from the kind of burden of slavery, because the Muslim population in Cape Town was originally here as slaves. And it's a really great part of what we offer in the city. But the problem is taking a picture of a beautiful house is very easy to do at a distance. And then you can move on and do something else and possibly spend your money somewhere else. So we've had major protests in that community where people saying, we just have a bunch of tour buses, but how does that convert into something that supports our community that's traditionally quite affected by poverty? And Cape Town Tourism, our partners in the local DMO, have done a lot of work in the community, improving the offering and managing it more than promoting it to help land the benefit of tourism in the book.
I think we're going to see more of that. And in a way, you don't have much over tourism in the Cape, but that clearly the response in the Bo-Kaap, which I've been watching, is an example of a very localized response to a feeling of being over visited. And there've been moments in the townships where that's come up as well. And luckily, I think the big coaches have more or less stopped going in there. which has taken away some of that response. But I think one of the things that's come through from this is this sense of the real importance of local management, with the people, the inbound operators and the local businesses working together to make tourism better. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I think a kind of neat way to round this up would be to give each of you a minute to say, if I asked you what would be the single most important thing to do to make tourism better on a bigger scale over the next 10 years, what would you say? Venetia first.
I think I would say that, coming together as a community, not just in our own respective countries, I think coming globally together would be something really good to go ahead with, and particularly learning from different examples, because I think examples are replicable, and, there are a lot of things which we haven't still seen. So that would do a lot of good to, new forms of tourism. So I think that's one thing I would say is important.
Thanks, Venetia. Nikki.
Sorry. My single biggest wish is probably for, and I suppose slightly selfish, is for more people to collaborate, and for the money that is available for development to be channeled into the right channels, not for more research, but for actually implementation.
Good Lord, you don't want the international consultants to stop doing feasibility studies, do you, Nikki?
Yeah, I do.
So do I. I'm tired of them. Eugenio.
Well, as I said before, I think to strengthen the role of local or destination management organizations, which means also training local experts, including those of the local community who will participate in the management organization, for them to enable them to monitor tourism, and connecting to this, to have a good set of indicators to measure progress or non-progress, to measure what is happening on the environment and on the community with tourism. Those would be my point.
And of course, Eugenio, that would be quite empowering for the local community that was involved in doing that, wouldn't it? It would shift some of the power towards the community. Shannon. I'm sorry that I asked you a question you hadn't been asked for 20 years. I'm pleased that in a way you've not been asked it, but I'm still apologetic. What would you say to the other question? What do you think is the best way forward now?
Me. I would say to tour operators and those in the travel and tourism business to understand their impact, measure it, and to be able to identify, set targets against what change they can affect in the destination and through their own operations. It's critical to my peers.
Thanks, Shannon. And Tim, you're going to have almost the last word.
I think it's really important to scale up the way we recognize best practice, and we recognize examples that aren't necessarily in the international discourse, but we start putting them there, start putting a spotlight on them. I think it shows other destinations and other attractions how they need to change, but also it makes consumers think again, and particularly in this time where people are starting to make super important travel decisions as they return to global travel. I think there's the potential for us all to start framing those choices by putting a spotlight on the parts of the tourism industry that have long embraced responsible and sustainable travel.
Thanks very much, Tim. I'd just like to say one thing from my side in closing this, apart from saying a really big thank you. I think it's been a great session with the five of you. One of the things I managed to do on a panel this week, which will be shown at WTM Africa, was bring back together Rupesh Kumar from India and Adam Abbar from the Gambia, which has only been possible because we've managed to do it on Zoom in a conversation like this. I think, Tim, there would be a lot to be learnt by operators in South Africa, and by that I mean the smaller operators, actually having discussions with people from India and making that cross-fertilization happen, which has traditionally been too expensive to do. But what Zoom has done is make it possible to do it. And Shannon, if we could involve some of your product managers and marketeers in those Zoom conferences as well. Just small groups, 5 or 6 people with a similar kind of environment and issue to deal with. If we could bring some of them together on Zoom, we might accelerate the learning by bringing people together from different cultures and different places. We are, after all, internationally all largely in the same marketplace, and we can learn a lot, I think, from each other about how to deal with the tourists and how to attract them and how to do it in a different kind of way. But I'm really sorry we've run out of time. It would have been easy to go on for another 2 or 3 hours. But really, thank you very much, all of you, for your contribution this afternoon. Thank you.